She is an aberration. Useless, her father sneers, sighing his blood for whiskey. The terrified girl, rejected by all, awaits her fate. But the mountain man, who buys her news, he sees a shocking detail in her rose-colored eyes, a silent, unbreakable strength. He holds out his hand. The choice she makes next changes the mountain forever. In the veins of Purgatory Gulch, a town clinging to the desert's edge like a weary pilgrim, life was carved from stone and prejudice. It was on a day when the sun punished the parched earth that the bargain was struck. Marcus Thorne, a man whose fortune was as vast as his poverty of spirit, finalized the transaction. He slid a half-empty bottle of whiskey across the rough-hewn table of the saloon, his eyes avoiding the figure opposite him. The payment, a stack of silver fox and ermine pelts, lay untouched. They were a king's ransom, but they were not what Marcus was buying. He was buying relief. She is, as I said, an aberration. Marcus slurred, his voice a low conspiratorial hiss. Useless. A blemish on my name. What you do with her? Well, that is your concern, Hawk. The man across from him, Elias Eli Hawk, the mountain man of Widow's Crown, did not reply. His legend was larger than himself, a myth of beard and shadow and eyes that held the wisdom of the ages. He simply nodded once, a gesture as final as a gavel fall. He had come down from his kingdom of peaks for supplies, and he would be returning with something far more unusual. The aberration was his daughter, Lyra. Born with skin the color of fresh milk and hair like spun snow, she was not, in her father's eyes, a child. She was a specter. In a town built on brittle faith and hard judgments, Lyra was a sign of a hidden sin, a physical manifestation of ill fortune. Her eyes, the color of a pale rose, seemed to reflect only her father's superstition and the quiet contempt the town whispered behind his back. Her mother, a woman of fragile spirit, had seen the girl once, let out a single soundless cry, and turned her face to the wall. She wilted in that house, consumed by a silent, unnamed sadness, leaving Lyra to bear the weight of her father's shame alone. Lyra grew up in the penumbra. She was a silent prisoner within the imposing walls of the Thorne Mansion, the grandest house in Purgatory Gulch. Her days were woven from the threads of profound loneliness, her nights filled with the echoes of her father's heavy, drunken footsteps and the cruel, muttered words that slipped from his lips. To the townsfolk, she was a ghost story told to frighten wayward children, a rumor of the Thorne affliction. But the isolation that was designed to break her instead forged a serene resilience. She learned to find companionship in the frantic, jeweled buzz of a hummingbird hovering just outside her sealed window. She learned to see a universe of beauty in the way the afternoon sun, the only visitor her father could not block, sent shafts of light through the heavy drapes, illuminating the slow, ethereal dance of dust motes. Her heart, though deeply wounded by the constant, cold rejection, beat with a quiet, steady strength. It was a silent promise that her story would not end in the shadows of that house. And now, that story was taking a turn she could never have imagined. The saloon door creaked open, and a young servant girl, her eyes wide with fear, motioned to Marcus. He grunted, pushing himself up from the table. "She is ready," he said to Eli. The bargain was sealed not with a handshake, but with the clink of coins Marcus tossed to the servant. Lyra was brought from the house, a small bundle of her few belongings clutched in her hand. She stood in the blinding, hostile sunlight of Purgatory Gulch, a place she had only ever seen through glass. She was a creature of shadow thrust into a burning world. Her father stood on the saloon porch, his face a mask of disgust. "Go, then," he spat, gesturing not to her, but to Eli. "Your new master awaits." Lyra's terror was a cold, sharp thing, a blade beneath her ribs. She looked at the mountain man, this myth of the wilderness, expecting to see the same brutality she had known from her father. She expected to see greed, or cruelty, or at best, a cold indifference. But Elias Hawk did not look at her that way. He stepped down from the porch, his sheer size blocking the cruel sun. He knelt, an act that seemed as foreign to him as the paved street beneath his moccasins, bringing his ancient eyes level with hers. The narrator, who knows the hearts of all men, saw the truth of that moment. Where Marcus Thorne saw a flawed, useless thing, Eli Hawk saw a wonder. He looked at her, not with repulsion, but with the same quiet reverence he held for a perfect, snow-capped peak touched by the first light of dawn. He saw the resilience, the silent strength she had hoarded in the darkness. He held out a hand, calloused and scarred from a life of survival. It was not the hand of a master, but of a guide. "They call me Eli," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep within the earth. "You will not be harmed, child. The mountain, she does not judge. She only acolytes." Lyra looked from the father who had sold her to the stranger who had bought her. One represented a life of civilized cruelty, the other, an unknown, savage freedom. She took a single, trembling step and placed her pale, small hand into his. The journey from Purgatory Gulch was a silent one. The townsfolk, those who had gathered to witness the transaction, watched her go with a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous relief. They saw the aberration, the thorn affliction, being led away by the savage of Widow's Crown. It was, to them, a fitting end, one freak being claimed by another. Lyra did not look back. She did not need to see her father's face. She had felt the burning shame of his gaze her entire life. She did not need to see the relief as he turned his back on her for the last time, retreating into the saloon to celebrate his newfound freedom with the silver fox pelts. The town was built on the edge of the desert, and the first mile was a flat, sun-baked expanse of cracked earth and withered scrub. For Lyra, who had spent her life in the cool, perpetual twilight of shuttered rooms, the sun was a physical assault. It was a merciless, heavy hand that pressed down on her, blinding her. Her pale skin, never touched by direct light, began to prickle and burn almost immediately. The dust, kicked up by Eli's long measured strides, coated her thin dress and clung to the moisture on her cheeks. Elias moved with the economy of a man who has walked thousands of miles. His pace was not fast, but it was relentless, and Lyra, whose legs were weak from a lifetime of disuse, began to falter within the first hour. Her breath came in short, painful gasps. The world, once a rectangle of glass, was now a vast, tilting and terrifying expanse of light and heat. She stumbled, her soft indoor shoes no match for the sharp stones of the trail. Finally, her ankle turned, and she fell, a small, pale heap in the unforgiving dirt. She landed hard, the impact jarring through her bones. She lay still for a moment, waiting for the inevitable. She waited for the kick, the rough hand dragging her to her feet, the barked, angry words that always followed any sign of weakness in her father's house. This, she thought, was the end of the pretense. The bargain was made. Now the brutality would begin. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clutching the hot dirt, but the blow never came. Instead, there was silence. A silence so profound it was more noticeable than a shout. Slowly, Lyra opened her eyes, the rose-colored irises shrinking against the glare. Eli had stopped. He was standing perhaps 10 yards ahead, his back to her. He had not turned. He was simply waiting, as patient as the stone monoliths that loomed in the distance. He knew she had fallen. He was giving her a choice, to get up or to be left. This was the first law of the wilderness she was entering. The call to action was not a command from him, but a demand from life itself. Lyra looked at his broad back, a wall of buckskin and quiet strength. He was not her father. He would not force her. He would simply leave. And the thought of being left, alone in this burning, alien world, was a terror far greater than her pain. With a sob that was half will, half despair, she pushed herself up. Her palms were scraped raw, bleeding small bright beads against the white of her skin. She was unsteady, her entire body a symphony of new aches. She took one step, then another. Only when she was a few feet behind him did Eli begin to walk again. But this time, his pace was different. It was slower, measured not to his own long stride, but to her faltering, painful steps. He had not offered a hand to help her up. He had not spoken a word of comfort. He had done something more profound. He had acknowledged her effort, and he had adapted to her limitation. He had, in his own silent way, folded her into his protection. The flat desert floor began to rise, tilting upward into the foothills. The ascent was brutal. Lyra's lungs burned, a fire that matched the one on her skin. The sun was a torment, and she felt a dizzying sickness welling up in her. Eli stopped again, this time by a small shaded overhang where a sliver of dark green moss hinted at moisture. He unslung his canteen, took a short drink, then held it out to her. Lyra stared at it, uncomprehending. He nudged it forward. "Drink," he commanded. It was the first word he had spoken since leaving town. She took the canteen, her hands trembling, and drank. The water was cool and sweet, and it was the kindest gesture she had ever known. As she drank, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, buckskin-wrapped packet. He opened it to reveal a dark, pungent salve. He gestured to her face, her arms. "The sun," he said. "It is not for you. This will help." He showed her how to apply the salve, a mixture of animal fat and herbs, and though it smelled of pine and damp earth, it instantly cooled the burning of her skin. He then unwrapped a larger piece of cloth, a thin, gauzy linen. "Cover your head." "Your hair." Lyra did as he instructed, wrapping the cloth around her head and face, leaving only a small slit for her eyes. The world became muted, shaded, and for the first time, she could breathe. He was not just protecting her from malice, he was protecting her from the world itself, a world she was not made for. They continued to climb, Eli now stopping every hour. He was teaching her without words. He would point to a circling hawk high above, and she would watch its patient, spiraling hunt. He would touch the trunk of a gnarled, twisted pine, and she would see how it clung to the rock, a lesson in survival. He was showing her a new language, the grammar of the mountain. Her fear, though still present, began to make room for something else, a fragile, trembling curiosity. She saw a cluster of bright blue flowers pushing up between two rocks, a defiance of color in a world of brown and gray. She saw a lizard, a tiny emerald jewel, sunning itself on a stone. This was the world her father had hidden from her, the world he had told her was ugly and harsh, and yet it held these small, fierce beauties. As the sun finally began to dip, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, they made their first camp. It was a sheltered spot beneath a granite overhang. Eli started a fire with a speed and efficiency that seemed like magic to her. He handed her a small pot. "Creek," he said, pointing into the deepening shadows. "Water." He was not asking her to serve him. He was giving her a task, a role in their shared survival. She found the creek, her heart pounding at the gathering dark, and filled the pot. When she returned, he was skewering pieces of dried meat. He gave her one, and she ate. The smoky, salty taste, the most delicious thing she had ever known. As they sat by the fire, the vast starry sky stretching above them like a black, diamond-strewn blanket, Eli finally spoke again. "The mountain will test you, child," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the flames. "She will demand everything. Your strength, your will, your fear." He turned his gaze to her, his eyes in the firelight seeming to hold all the wisdom of the stars. "But I gave my word. I will not let her claim you." It was the same promise he had made in the saloon. But here, in the vast, wild cathedral of the high country, It was no longer a bargain. It was a vow. The climb to Widow's Crown was an ascent into the sky. The foothills gave way to sheer granite faces, and the trail became a narrow, winding ledge, a scar on the side of the world. Purgatory Gulch was no longer visible, swallowed first by the hills, then by the clouds themselves. The air grew thin and cold, so sharp it felt like breathing powdered glass. Lyra, who had only ever known the thick, dusty air of her sealed room, felt a lightness in her head, a dizzying, terrifying clarity. She moved in a haze of exhaustion, her body a single, dull ache, but she kept moving. The rule had been established. She would not be carried, but she would not be left. Eli moved ahead, a silent, steady presence, his pace now perfectly attuned to her own. He was part of this vertical world, as natural as the wind and the stone. She learned to watch him, to mimic his movements. Where he placed his foot, she placed hers. When he paused to listen, she held her breath, straining to hear what he heard: the distant scree of an eagle, the rumble of shifting rock far below, the first whisper of a coming wind. Her world, once defined by four walls, had exploded. It was now a terrifying, limitless expanse of sky and stone. The sun, which had been her enemy in the desert, was different here. It was a cold, white fire, and the higher they climbed, the more she understood Eli's reverence for it. It was the only source of warmth in this high, lonely place. After 2 more days of climbing, a journey that blurred into a single, agonizing effort, she thought she could go no further. Her legs were water, her lungs on fire. She stopped, leaning against a rock face, shaking. Eli stopped with her. He did not look back, but simply stood, letting her draw in the thin air. He pointed, his arm extending not up, but forward. "We are here," he said. Lyra followed his gesture. Ahead, the trail seemed to end, blocked by a massive curtain of ancient, gnarled pines that grew directly from the rock. It looked impassable, a final, unyielding wall. Eli walked toward it, and as he reached the trees, he pushed aside a heavy, low-hanging bough. Lyra followed, ducking under the branch, and stepped through. The world changed. The wind, which had been a constant, howling assault on the open ledge, softened to a murmur. The air was warmer, still. They were in a place the mountain hid. Widow's Crown was not a peak. It was a bowl, a hidden alpine meadow cupped in a circle of granite spires that tore at the sky. It was a secret garden at the top of the world. A waterfall, fed by the snows above, cascaded down one wall. Its water so clear, it seemed to be liquid light, feeding a small, impossibly blue lake. The cabin was not a cabin. It was part of the mountain itself, built from the same gray granite, its back wall the sheer face of the cliff. Its roof was thick sod, covered in the same tough grasses and tiny, vibrant flowers as the meadow. It was a den, a sanctuary, a place that had not been built on the land, but from it. Eli led her to the door, a heavy plank of timber, and pushed it open. The inside was one large room, warm and dim, smelling of pine smoke, dried herbs, and the faint, musky scent of tanned leather. A stone hearth, black with soot, dominated one wall, a low fire already crackling within it. Furs were piled on a simple low bed frame. Dried plants and bundles of herbs hung from the rafters. The furniture was simple, carved from the same pines that guarded the entrance. It was a place of function, of survival, but it was not cold. It was the safest place she had ever been. Eli gestured to a smaller alcove, curtained off with a heavy blanket. "This is yours," he said, "your space." Inside, there was a small cot, piled with soft rabbit furs, and a set of empty shelves. It was a room of her own, the first she had ever had that was not a prison. He turned back to her, and his eyes, which held the ancient patience of the peaks, were serious. "There are rules here," he said, his voice filling the quiet space. "They are not my rules. They are the rules of the mountain. First, You do not waste. Not food, not water, not wood, not light. Every scrap is life. Second, you do not fear. Fear is a desert sickness. Here it will kill you faster than the cold. You will be aware, you will be cautious, but you will not fear. Third, you will work. The mountain demands a toll from all who live on her. You will earn your place here, not from me, but from her. I am not your master, I am your teacher. You will learn the plants, the animals, the sky. You will learn to be silent. You will learn to see. He unslung his pack and placed it by the hearth. Today, the lesson is water. That pot, he pointed to a clay jug by the door, you will keep it full. The waterfall is clean. It is your first task. He did not wait for an answer. He took his rifle from the wall and stepped back outside, leaving her alone in the cabin. Lyra stood frozen in the center of the room. The silence was absolute. There were no jeers from the street, no drunken, stumbling footsteps from the hall, no whispered, pitying words from servants. There was only the sound of the crackling fire and the distant, muffled music of the waterfall. She was alone. But for the first time in her life, she was not lonely. She looked at her small, pale hands, still raw from the journey. She was no longer Lyra, the thorn affliction, the aberration, the ghost of Purgatory Gulch. Here, she was not a thing to be hidden. She was a person with a task. She picked up the clay jug, the weight of it unfamiliar but solid, and walked to the door. She stepped out into the crisp, clean air of the meadow, a place of impossible beauty, and walked toward the sound of the water. A survivor taking her first, true step toward a life of her own. Life on Widow's Crown was a lesson in essentials. The first was water. Lyra's days began with the cold, heavy weight of the clay jug. The path to the waterfall was short, but the air was so thin that by the time she returned, her lungs burned and her head felt light. She learned to move slowly, to breathe with intention, to hoard her energy as Eli hoarded firewood. Her second task was the fire. Eli showed her once his large scarred hands moving with deft precision, laying the kindling, striking a spark from flint and steel. The next morning, he simply pointed to the cold hearth. It took her an agonizing hour, her hands clumsy and her eyes stinging from smoke. But when the first, fragile flame caught, she felt a surge of pride that was warmer than the fire itself. Her third task was learning. Eli would walk the meadow, and she would follow, a pale shadow at his heels. He never spoke. He would simply stop, point to a plant, and crush a leaf between his fingers, holding it to her nose. One was sharp and medicinal, another sweet like mint, a third had a bitter, warning smell. He would crouch, touch a track in the soft earth by the lake, and shape his hand to mimic the hoof of a deer or the paw of a rabbit. Her senses, so long dulled by the shadows of her room, began to sharpen, but they were also her enemy. The high-altitude sun was a physical pain. Her rose-colored eyes, unprotected, saw the world in a blinding, painful glare. The first time she went to the waterfall without her linen wrap, the light reflecting off the water struck her with the force of a blow, sending her to her knees, dizzy and sick. Eli found her there, her hands over her eyes. He said nothing. He simply took her arm, led her back to the cabin, and silently held out the linen wrap and the jar of dark salve. The lesson was clear. She was different. The mountain would not change for her. She must learn to navigate it as she was. She became a creature of the long shadows, of the early morning and the late evening. She learned to read the sun's position not for time, but for safety, moving through the world in the shade of the granite spires. She learned the language of silence. She learned that the snap of a twig was not just a sound, but a story, a deer passing, a fox hunting. She learned to sit so still that the tiny jewel-toned birds would land near her, their heads cocked in curiosity. Eli's silence, once a wall of intimidation, became a shared space. It was the silence of two people listening to the same vast, quiet world. They ate their meals in this quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoon against wooden bowl. She had never known such peace. There was no judgment in the silence. There was no anger. There was only the solid, steady presence of the man across the hearth and the mountain outside. The first true test came not from a beast, but from the sky itself. The day began with a strange, oppressive stillness. The air was thick, and the light had a sickly, greenish-yellow tint. Eli, who had been skinning a rabbit, suddenly went still. He sniffed the air, and his eyes went to the granite spires that ringed their meadow. "Inside," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now, and bar the door." Lyra hurried to obey, her heart beginning to pound. The silence outside had become a deafening, heavy blanket. The moment she slid the heavy wooden bar into place, the world exploded. A sound like a mountain breaking in two cracked the sky. The cabin, built of stone, vibrated with the force of it. A wall of wind hit them, a physical, shrieking force that seemed to claw at the sod roof. Then came the hail. It was not rain. It was a volley of ice, as large as her thumb, hammering their shelter. The noise was a deafening, terrifying roar, a primal assault that shook the very foundations of the granite walls. This was a violence Lyra had never known. The cruelty of her father was a quiet, cold thing. This was a raw, chaotic, and impersonal fury. She shrank back, her hands flying to her ears, a small cry of terror escaping her lips. She was back in Purgatory Gulch, a child cowering in the dark as her father's drunken rage echoed through the house. Then, through the din, she heard another sound, a high-pitched, desperate bleating. Eli kept a small herd of 5 shaggy-haired goats in a 3-sided lean-to against the cliff face. They were his source of milk and cheese, and he tended them with the same practical care he gave everything. The storm had sent them into a blind panic. Eli moved to the small, thick-paned window, peering out into the white, swirling chaos. "The latch on the gate," he swore, a rare burst of anger. "It's given way." Lyra peered over his shoulder. Through the curtain of hail, she could see 4 of the goats huddled against the cliff. But the 5th, the smallest, a kid born just that spring, was not with them. It was stumbling, blind with terror, toward the other side of the meadow, toward the place where the waterfall fed the lake, and the ground fell away in a sheer, treacherous drop. "Stay here," Eli commanded. He grabbed his heaviest oilcloth coat, his face set like stone. He was going after it. But as he reached for the bar, a gust of wind so powerful it seemed to shake the mountain itself and hit the door, tearing at the wood. The heavy bar groaned, and a crack appeared in the timber. Eli threw his full weight against it, fighting to hold it in place. If the door gave way, the storm would gut their home in minutes. He was trapped, a prisoner holding back the siege. He looked at Lyra, his eyes desperate. "The goat," he said, and she knew. He could not go. He was giving her a choice. The rule was clear. You do not fear. Lyra looked at the door, where Eli struggled. She looked out the window at the terrified, bleeding kid. She remembered its small, warm body, when Eli had shown her how to milk its mother. She remembered her own terror, alone, in the desert. She made her choice. She grabbed a thick wool blanket from her cot and, before Eli could protest, she unbarred the second, smaller door at the back of the cabin, the one that led to the woodpile, and slipped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The hail was needles of ice, stinging her pale skin through her thin dress. The wind stole her breath. For a moment, her old fear, the cowering, helpless terror, seized her. She was a ghost. She was useless. But then she heard the kid's cry again, a sound of pure panic and a new, fierce instinct she did not know she possessed. Uncoiled within her, she pulled the blanket over her head and ran. The ground was slick with ice. She fell, scraped her knee on the frozen earth, but scrambled up, her gaze fixed on the small white shape. The kid was at the very edge of the cliff, bleating at the roaring water. She reached it, her hands numb, her body shaking so hard she could barely stand. The kid was frozen, its legs splayed, its eyes wide with terror. "It's all right," she shouted over the wind, her voice torn away by the gale. "I'm here." She threw the blanket over the small, shivering body, wrapping it tight, and scooped it into her arms. It was heavier than she expected. She turned back toward the cabin, a journey of 50 yards that felt like a mile. The wind was against her now, trying to push her back toward the cliff. She lowered her head, her feet slipping, her lungs burning, clutching the warm, trembling life against her chest. She made it to the lean-to, her entire body a single throbbing bruise. She pushed the kid in with its mother, who bleated in relief, and slammed the broken gate, securing it with a piece of rope Eli had left. Only then did she allow herself to run to the cabin. She fell through the back door, collapsing onto the stone floor, soaked, shivering, and victorious. Eli was there. The main door was secure. He had seen it all from the window. He stood over her, his face unreadable in the dim light. She looked up, her teeth chattering, expecting, she didn't know what. A scolding for disobeying, for her recklessness? He did not speak. He simply knelt, took the soaked, frozen blanket from her shoulders, and lifted her as easily as she had lifted the kid. He sat her on the stool by the fire, wrapped her in the thickest, driest fur from his own bed, and pushed a hot cup of herbal tea into her numb hands. She drank, the warmth spreading through her, chasing away the bone-deep chill. He sat across from her, his eyes fixed on her face. The storm still raged outside, but in the cabin there was a profound calm. Finally, he nodded. A single, slow, deliberate gesture. It was not praise. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition. She had not been a victim. She had not waited to be saved. She had faced the mountain's fury, and she had acted. She had earned her place. The storm passed, leaving the meadow scoured and clean, the air sharp with the scent of ozone and wet pine. The bond forged in the hail and wind settled into a new, deeper quiet. But the mountain, having tested them with fury, now presented a more subtle trial. The water in the lake began to drop. It was not a sudden loss, but a slow, insidious theft. The booming cascade of the waterfall, the meadow's very heartbeat, softened, thinning to a worried ribbon of water that barely fed the lake. Eli, a man who solved the world's problems with his hands and his will, was baffled. He spent his days in the harsh, bright sun, climbing the slick, treacherous rock face beside the falls, searching for a blockage, a shift in the stone. He would return at dusk, his hands raw from the granite, his face etched with a frustration that was new to Lyra. His strength, his experience, all of it was useless against a mystery. "The spring is failing," he said one evening, his voice tight with a rare helplessness. "I can't find the break. Without it, this place dies." His anxiety became a heavy blanket in the small cabin. He was a man of action, and this forced inaction was a kind of poison to him. He could fight a bear, he could weather a storm, but he could not fight a mountain that was slowly, silently turning its face from them. Lyra watched him, her own quiet fear, a cold knot in her stomach. This meadow, this sanctuary, was the only home she had ever known, and it was withering before her eyes. But as Eli, a creature of the sun, searched in the glare of the day, Lyra's world was just coming alive. She was a creature of the gloaming, her eyes most comfortable in the long, blue shadows of twilight. While Eli slept, his rest troubled by his failure, Lyra would walk the meadow. She felt the change in the land, a deep, thirsty hum beneath her feet. One evening, as the first stars began to prick the deep violet sky, she stood by the shrinking lake. The air was perfectly still. She watched the thinned waterfall, and her eyes, so accustomed to discerning shapes in near darkness, caught something Eli had missed. It was not at the top of the falls, where he had been searching, but near the base, hidden behind the main cascade, veiled by the spray. A shadow that wasn't moving. A darkness that was too dark. It was a crack, a new fissure in the rock face, and a significant portion of their life-giving water was vanishing into it, diverted away from the lake and into the mountain's deep stone gut. She could see it only now, when the light was soft, and the angle of the rising moon cast a faint, pale glow that highlighted the absence of water, rather than the bright, blinding reflection of it. She did not wake him. She knew her duty. This was her task. She took a coil of rope and a small, heavy pry bar from his tool shed. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest, but her hands were steady. She remembered the lesson of the storm. You will not fear. She was no longer the girl who had stumbled from Purgatory Gulch. She was a woman of this mountain. She climbed, her small, bare feet finding holds in the dark, slick rock that Eli's heavy boots would have missed. She moved with a silent, spectral grace, her white hair a pale banner in the moonlight. She reached the fissure. It was a fresh break, likely caused by the same storm that had tested their cabin. A large wedge of rock had shifted, creating a new, greedy channel. She worked, her hands, once soft and useless, now strong and sure. She wedged the pry bar into the crack, using the lessons of leverage Eli had taught her when setting his traps. She put her entire, fragile weight into it. The rock groaned, a deep, protesting sound. It did not move. She set her feet again, took a deeper breath, and pulled. A low, fierce sound tearing from her own throat, a sound of pure will. The rock shifted. It slipped, then fell with a heavy, satisfying splash into the pool below, and the water, released, exploded forth. The waterfall roared back to life, a triumphant, booming song in the night. She was soaked, her hands bleeding, her body trembling with exertion when Eli found her. He had woken instantly to the sound of the revived falls, his eyes wide with disbelief. He ran from the cabin and saw her, drenched and shivering in the moonlight, her pale skin almost luminous against the dark, wet stone, the pry bar still in her hand. He stood frozen, his heart pounding. She had not just solved the problem. She had done what he could not. She had seen what he, in his sun-blinded strength, had missed. She was not a burden. She was not a student. She was a part of this place, its guardian, as much as he was. Lyra looked down at him, her chest heaving. "The water," she said, her voice small but clear over the roar. "It's back." Eli said nothing. He simply climbed up to her, took the pry bar from her raw hands, and wrapped her in his own heavy coat. He held her for a long moment, his face buried in her damp, silver hair. The narrator, who sees all, saw the turning of his soul, the last of his solitary vow, the ghost of his old grief, washed away in the renewed cascade. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were filled with a raw, profound awe. "You see in the dark, child," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard. "You see what the sun blinds me to." He looked at her then, truly saw her, a woman of shadow and moonlight, a spirit of the in-between, as pale and powerful as the snows that crowned their peak. He had bought a useless aberration from a fool. He had received a goddess. The roar of the waterfall was the new, steady rhythm of their lives. After that night, Elias looked at Lyra not as a child he had rescued, but as a partner who had saved him. The helplessness that had gripped him when the water failed was a poison he hadn't tasted in years, the poison of inadequacy. Lyra, with her quiet strength and her eyes that saw in the dark, had been the antidote. He began, slowly, to treat her hands. They were badly cut and bruised from the pry bar and the sharp granite. He would sit her by the fire in the evenings, gently cleaning the wounds with a warm herbal wash. His touch, which she had once feared, was now impossibly tender, his scarred, calloused fingers moving with a surgeon's care as he bound them in clean linen. "These," he said one night, his thumb brushing over a fresh scar on her palm, "are not the hands of a ghost. They are the hands of the mountain. You have earned them." This new tenderness, this shared victory, unsealed the parts of himself he had walled off with stone and silence. He began to speak, not just of tasks, but of his life. His story, when it finally came, was not one of fever or loss, but of a betrayal so deep it had driven him from the world of men. He had not always been a hermit. He had been a guide, the best in the territory, renowned for knowing paths even the Ute did not. He had guided a group of wealthy prospectors from St. Louis, men with soft hands and greedy eyes. He led them into the high peaks, honoring his contract. They had found a small, rich vein of gold, and that night they had decided his knowledge was a liability. They offered him whiskey, and when he turned to look at the stars, they shot him in the back. They took his maps, his supplies, and left him for dead in a shallow grave. But the mountain, he said, his voice a low rumble, had not been finished with him. He had crawled, half dead, for weeks, living on roots and snowmelt, until he found this place, Widow's Crown, a hidden meadow his own father had shown him as a boy. He had healed his body, but the betrayal had poisoned his soul. He had sworn an oath that no civilized man would ever set foot in his sanctuary again. As Lyra listened, her own story, so long held in the prison of her chest, finally found its voice. She spoke of the cold, not the cold of the wind, but the cold of her father's gaze. She spoke of her mother, a woman who had not died, but had simply evaporated, turning into a silent, weeping shadow, who would flinch if Lyra entered the room. She spoke of the profound, aching loneliness of a life, where the only touch she had ever known was a shove, the only words, a curse. "You were left for dead," she whispered, looking at their hands, his large and scarred, hers small and pale. "I was never allowed to live." He understood. They were two halves of the same coin, both discarded by a world that valued only the perfect and the profitable. Their routine, once built on the rigid grammar of survival, softened into the poetry of a shared life. He still taught her, but the lessons were now conversations. He had a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and soft as cloth, a copy of Shakespeare he had saved from his old life. In the long evenings, by the fire's glow, he began to teach her to read. Her mind, so long starved, was a fertile, hungry thing. She learned with astonishing speed the sounds of the words Othello, Titania, Tempest, filling their cabin with a music it had never known. In return, she taught him a stillness he had never possessed. He was a man of action, of will. She was a creature of patience, of observation. She would take him to the edge of the lake at twilight, and teach him to watch to see the precise moment a trout rose for a fly, to see the subtle shift in the wind's direction by the ripple on the water. She brought her own life to the cabin. One day, while exploring the meadow's edge, she found a patch of wild columbine, their blue and white blossoms like tiny, perfect stars. She remembered the window boxes in Purgatory Gulch, the only beauty she had ever seen. Using an old cracked pot, she carefully transplanted one, filling it with the meadow's dark, rich earth. She set it by the cabin door, a small, defiant act of creation. When Eli returned from checking his traps, he stopped, his gaze fixed on the pot. He looked at the delicate flowers, then at Lyra. He did not speak, but he reached out and touched a single, perfect petal, a look of stunned wonder on his face. She, the aberration, had brought something to his stone fortress that he had forgotten existed, beauty for its own sake. The world outside, however, would not be kept at bay forever. A late-season blizzard, a freakish howling storm, caught a fur trapper named Jedediah practicing his trade too high in the peaks. He was lost, snowblind, and freezing, wandering in a white void. when he stumbled through the curtain of pines and fell into the meadow. He saw the cabin, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney, and crawled toward it, collapsing against the door. Eli heard the thud. He opened it, his knife in his hand, his eyes cold. His first instinct was to drag the man back out, to protect his sanctuary, to honor his vow. But Lyra was behind him. She saw the man, his face blue with cold, his beard caked in ice, and she did not see an intruder. She saw a life guttering like a candle in the wind. "Elias," she said, her voice soft but absolute, "we cannot." Her compassion, forged in a lifetime of her own suffering, was a force he could not deny. Together they dragged the trapper inside, stripped him of his frozen clothes, and wrapped him in warm furs by the fire. Lyra brewed her strongest, hottest herbal tea, forcing it between his cracked lips. The man, Jedediah, drifted in and out of a fevered delirium for 2 days. In his moments of waking, he saw a creature of impossible beauty tending to him. He saw a girl with hair like snow and eyes like pale roses, her movements gentle, her presence a soothing balm. He saw the massive, silent mountain man watching from the shadows, a guardian at her side. He thought he was dead. He thought he was in heaven, or perhaps a strange mountain purgatory, being tended by a snow spirit and her keeper. When his fever broke and his strength returned, Eli escorted him to the edge of the meadow. The trapper, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, looked back at the cabin, at Lyra, who stood in the doorway, a pale, serene figure. "You were never here," Eli commanded, his voice flat and final. "You were lost in the storm. You had a fever dream. What you saw? It was not real." Jedediah, a simple man who knew the laws of the wild, nodded, his throat tight. I saw nothing. A dream. Just the storm." He swore his oath and fled down the mountain. But a man cannot hold such a vision. He returned to Purgatory Gulch, his skin saved, but his mind altered. He kept his promise. He never spoke of a hidden meadow or a granite cabin, but he could not, for the life of him, keep silent about the vision that had saved him. He spoke in hushed, reverent tones in the saloon of being lost and dying, and being rescued by a spirit, an angel of the high peaks. A beautiful, spectral woman with hair like the snow, the White Lady of Widow's Crown. The legend had been born. The legend of the White Lady of Widow's Crown descended the mountain far faster than the trapper who had birthed it. It seeped into the cracks of Purgatory Gulch, a story whispered over whiskey and cards. It changed with each telling. She was a snow spirit, a healer, a ghost who guarded a lost spring. But in all the tellings, she was a thing of beauty, of magic, a balm against the harshness of the land. The story, inevitably, found its way to the ears of Marcus Thorne. Time had not been kind. Marcus was a ruined man. His fortune, built on luck and leveraged on cruelty, had crumbled. A series of bad investments, a string of even worse card games, and a liver pickled in cheap whiskey had left him a hollowed-out husk of the man he had been. The Grand Thorne Mansion was a dusty, silent mausoleum, its finery sold off piece by piece, its halls echoing with the ghost of his own failure. He sat in the same saloon where he had sold his daughter, now drinking on a meager, humiliating line of credit. He listened to the trappers speak of the goddess in the peaks, and a cold, venomous thing coiled in his gut. It was not love. It was not paternal regret. It was the consuming, agonizing envy of a man who had thrown away a winning lottery ticket. He had possessed this treasure, this aberration that men now spoke of with awe, and he had traded her for a handful of pelts that were long since gone. He saw her legend not as a miracle, but as his final, unplayed hand. This goddess was his last chance at redemption, not of the soul, but of the purse. He would reclaim what was his, but Marcus was a coward and a weakling. He could not climb the foothills, let alone storm a mountain fortress. He used the last dregs of his family's name, the lingering shadow of his former credit, to gather a group of men as desperate and morally bankrupt as himself. They were miners whose claims had dried up, gamblers running from debts, and at their lead, a man whose name was spoken only in whispers: Silas, the Jackal Vane. Vane was a bounty hunter, a man who saw the world in terms of profit and loss, flesh and coin. Marcus, in his cunning, did not tell them the truth. He did not speak of a daughter. He spun a tale of a mystical feral woman, a creature who guarded a hidden vein of gold, the real secret of Widow's Crown, which Eli Hawk had been hoarding for years. He offered them a share of this imagined, glittering prize. Vane, whose eyes were as dead and cold as winter stones, agreed. For him, a feral woman was just another pelt to be taken. Up on Widow's Crown, the long, peaceful summer was ending. The air was turning, a sharp bite in the wind that spoke of the coming snow. The peace was broken not by a sound, but by a sign. Eli had been checking his trap lines, ranging further down the mountain than he had in years, his new confidence in Lyra leaving him free to explore. He found it near the old pass, an abandoned campsite. It was too high, too exposed for any sane trapper. The ashes of the fire were cold, but not old, and burned into the trunk of a great pine, a symbol had been left, a crude, three-clawed mark. The sign of the jackal. Eli's blood ran cold. He knew that mark. It was a brand of possession, a warning that Vane was hunting in this territory. The intruders were not lost. They were predators. He returned to the cabin as dusk was falling, his movements tight with a new, cold anger. Lyra, who now read his silence as easily as she read her book, saw it instantly. "Elias?" she asked, her hand going to her throat. "What is it?" He did not soften the truth. "Men, they are coming. They are not lost. They are hunting." He laid his rifle on the table, its weight a heavy, final sound in the quiet room. "The trapper you saved. His story was a poison. It has drawn the sickness of the towns up to our door. The idyllic peace of their found family shattered, replaced by the brittle, cold tension of a coming war." Eli was no longer a hermit protecting his isolation. He was a father protecting his child. He opened a locked chest beneath his bed, a chest Lyra had never seen him touch. From it, he pulled a small, light rifle, perfectly sized, and a long, sharp hunting knife in a leather sheath. He laid them on the table before her. "I have taught you how to live on this mountain," he said, his voice a low, hard thing. "Now, I must teach you how to fight the men who would take it from you." Lyra stared at the weapons, her mind recoiling. This was the world she had fled. The world of violence, of cruelty, of men who took what they wanted. The cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt as fragile as a bird's nest. The terror she had kept at bay for so long, the cowering, helpless fear of her father's house, rushed back in, a cold, suffocating tide. She backed away, shaking her head, her hands fluttering to her chest. "No," she whispered. "No, not men, not here. This is safe." She retreated to her alcove, to the cot of soft furs, and curled into herself, her eyes wide and blank, with a familiar, haunted dread. Eli watched her, his heart breaking. He saw, for the first time, not the goddess of the waterfall, but the ghost of Purgatory Gulch, the child who had learned that survival meant becoming invisible. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He did not kneel. He did not offer tea. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip not gentle, but fierce, an anchor of pure, unyielding will. He pulled her to her feet. "Look at me, Lyra." She flinched, but his gaze held her, demanding, "You are not that girl. You are not a ghost. You are the woman of this mountain. You faced the storm. You saved the water. You saved me." His hands were iron on her arms, forcing strength back into her. "They are coming. They will not ask. They will not bargain. They will take you, and they will destroy this place. They will destroy us. He saw the terror in her eyes begin to war with the new strength she had found. He would feed that strength. You will not hide, he vowed, his voice a raw, primal promise. They will not take you from me. I will burn their world to the ground before I let one of them set foot in this meadow. Now, you will learn. The lessons were brutal and swift. There was no more time for the slow poetry of reading. This was the harsh prose of survival. Eli taught Lyra to move not like a deer, but like a shadow. He taught her the cold arithmetic of the rifle, how to load, aim, and fire until her shoulders ached and the smell of gunpowder was etched into her senses. He gave her the long knife. This is not for skinning, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. This is for a man's ribs. You aim up, under the cage. It is a terrible thing. But it is a more terrible thing to be taken. He was forging her fear into a weapon, sharpening her resilience into a blade. The girl who had flinched from a raised voice now learned to track armed men, her pale, bare feet making no sound on the pine needle floor, as Eli taught her to be the ghost they had rumored her to be. They prepared their fortress. Eli was a master of this land, and he would make it bleed for the intruders. He set traps, not the simple snares for rabbits, but deadfalls of heavy logs, pits lined with sharpened stakes, all hidden with a hunter's deadly art, along the single, narrow approach to their meadow. He stored water, barricaded the weaker points of the cabin, and created a second, hidden exit, a narrow chimney in the rock that led to a high ledge. If I fall, he told her, his eyes holding hers, you will go. You will not look back. You will take the high pass to the northern valleys. You will live. Lyra's hand, now calloused and strong, closed over his. We will not fall, Elias, she said, her voice a low, steady echo of his own. The terror was still there, but it no longer ruled her. It was a cold, clean fire, fueling a resolve she had never known. The attack came in the gray, frozen light of dawn. Eli heard them first, the clumsy crunch of a boot on frozen gravel, the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. The sickness of Purgatory Gulch had arrived. Lyra, posted at the small window, her own rifle in hand, saw them. 6 men, led by a 7th, whose face was a map of old scars, Silas Vane. And lagging behind, wheezing in the thin air, his face a blotchy purple mask of exertion and whiskey, was her father. 6, she whispered, her voice preternaturally calm. And Marcus, Eli nodded, his face grim. Vane is mine. The others, they are just fools. They will break. The first fool met his end at the pass. He was a gambler, eager for his gold, and stepped directly into the path of a log deadfall. The sound was a wet, heavy thud, followed by a single, cut-off scream that echoed in the cold air. The men stopped, their bravado shattered. It's a trap. Vane's voice was a harsh bark. Spread out. Find another way up. But there was no other way. This was Eli's land. Thorn! Vane shouted, grabbing Marcus by his fine, ruined coat. Is this the easy prize you promised? Marcus, his eyes wide with terror, could only babble. He was just a man, a hermit, a second man, trying to circle the trap, slipped on the icy rock. His cry cut short as he fell into the chasm below. 6 had become 4. He's killing us! One of the miners shrieked, his nerve breaking. There's no gold, just death! He turned to run, but Vane was faster. The bounty hunter's pistol cracked once. The miner fell, a dark stain spreading on the snow. The only way out is up, Vane snarled at the remaining 2. Forward. They advanced with the shuffling, terrified steps of men marching to their graves. They made it to the curtain of pines, the entrance to the meadow, believing the worst was over. Eli was waiting. His first shot, fired from the roof of the cabin, took one of the miners in the chest. He collapsed without a sound. The second miner threw down his rifle and raised his hands, screaming for mercy. Don't shoot, I give. Eli held his fire. Vane, in a single, fluid motion of disgust, shot the surrendering man in the back. Useless, he spat. He was alone now, save for the cowering, weeping shape of Marcus Thorne. Get up, old man, Vane growled, hauling Marcus to his feet. You're my shield. He shoved Marcus in front of him, the pistol pressed to his temple, and began his slow, deliberate advance on the cabin. Hawk! He bellowed, his voice filling the meadow. I know you're in there, mountain man, and I know what you're hiding. Send out the girl, and I'll let the old man live. Marcus, his legs buckling, sobbed. Lyra, child, please, it's your father. Help me. The sound of his voice, the whimpering, pathetic plea, pierced Lyra's calm. It was the voice of her nightmares, the sound of her prison. Eli looked at her, his face a mask of stone. He is nothing, Lyra, a ghost. But Vane was smart. He was using Marcus not just as a shield, but as a poison, a way to break their will. He fired a shot into the cabin door. I'll burn you out, Hawk. Burn the girl and the gold with you. Lyra watched from the window, her rifle steady. She saw her father, the man who had sold her, now being used as a pawn. She saw the man who had bought him, Vane, a creature of pure, cold malice. And she saw Elias, who stood beside her, his breath steady, his will a tangible thing, ready to die for her. In that moment, the last of the ghost of Purgatory Gulch burned away. He is not a shield, Lyra said, her voice so cold it chilled the air. He is just a man in the way. She raised her rifle, but she did not aim at Vane. She did not aim at her father. She aimed at the ground, just in front of his feet. She fired. The bullet spat ice and rock into her father's face. Marcus screamed, a high, thin shriek of pure terror, and dove sideways, scrambling away from Vane, tumbling into a snowdrift. He was no longer a shield. He was just a coward. Vane was exposed. He roared in anger, raising his pistol to fire at Marcus, but Eli was faster. The mountain man's rifle cracked. Vane cried out, the pistol flying from his hand as the bullet shattered his wrist. But he was not called the Jackal for nothing. He was wounded, but not beaten. With his left hand, he drew a long, heavy knife and charged the cabin door, a low, murderous howl tearing from his throat. Eli met him. He did not fire again. This was not a hunt. This was a war. He threw open the door and met Vane's charge with his own knife. The two men crashed together, a tangle of buckskin and fury. It was a fight of brutal, primal strength. They rolled in the snow, knives flashing. Vane was fast, a creature of bar brawls and back-alley murder. But Eli was the mountain. He was stone and ice and will. He took a cut to his arm, another to his ribs, but his grip was iron. Lyra watched from the doorway, her rifle raised, but she could not get a clean shot. The men were a knot of violence. Vane, seeing her, grinned, his teeth red. He used Eli's weight against him, rolling them, trying to get to her. The snow-white prize, he hissed, his good hand grabbing for her ankle. That was his final mistake. He had taken his eyes off his true enemy. Eli, with a roar that was more bear than man, drove his own knife home. The sound was a heavy, wet thud. Vane's eyes went wide, a look of profound surprise on his scarred face. He shuddered once, and then went still. Silence, absolute and profound, fell over the meadow. The snow was stained. The air smelled of gunpowder and blood. Eli pushed himself up, his chest heaving, his arm and side bleeding freely. He looked at Vane's body, then at the trembling, sobbing heap in the snow that was Marcus Thorne. Then he looked at Lyra. She was pale, shaking, but she had not run. She was still holding the rifle. He walked to her, took the weapon from her trembling hands, and pulled her into his arms, holding her head against his chest. It is done. He breathed into her silver hair. The sickness it is done. Lyra clutched him, her body finally letting go, a single wrenching sob breaking from her. She was safe. They were safe. She had not been a ghost. She had been a fortress. The meadow was silent. The only sounds were the rising wind and the pathetic, broken sobs of Marcus Thorne. He was a heap in the snow, his fine coat muddied, his face a mask of abject terror. The violence, the greed, the righteous fury, all of it had bled out of him, leaving only this empty, weeping husk. Lyra looked at the man who had been her father, the source of all her pain, and felt nothing. Not pity, not hatred, just a vast, cold emptiness. He was a stranger, more alien to her than the granite spires. Eli, leaning heavily on his rifle, his side a dark, spreading stain, walked over to him. He stood over Marcus, a silent, bloody judge. This was the man who had sold his own child, who had brought this sickness to his home. Eli's hand tightened on his knife, but he looked at Lyra. He saw her face, calm and empty, and he knew a quick death was not justice. It was an escape. He nudged Marcus with his boot. "Get up." Marcus flinched, scrambling backward like a crab. Please, please, I was tricked." "Vain." Get up." Eli's voice was flat, as cold and hard as the ice on the lake. Marcus, trembling, struggled to his feet. Eli walked back to the cabin, retrieved a single wool blanket and a small packet of dried meat, the same provisions a trapper might be given. He threw them at Marcus's feet. "You cast her out," Eli said, his voice quiet, but it carried across the meadow with the weight of a final judgment. "You left her to the wilderness, believing it would be her grave. Now it will be your judge." He pointed down the treacherous, ice-slicked pass, the path Vane's men had died on. "You were never here. Your men are gone. You will walk down this mountain, and you will never return. If the mountain sees fit to let you live, that is her business, not mine." Marcus stared, uncomprehending. He had expected a knife, a bullet. This was an exile. He was being given the same fate he had given his daughter. He snatched the supplies, his hands shaking, and with one last, terrified look at the silent, pale woman in the doorway, he turned. He scrambled, slipped, and stumbled his way to the curtain of pines and vanished. Lyra watched him go. She watched until the sound of his clumsy, panicked descent faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the peaks. She took a long, slow breath, the first clean breath of her life. The ghost of Purgatory Gulch was gone. She turned. Elias was leaning against the cabin wall, his face pale, his hand pressed tight against his bleeding side. The adrenaline was fading, and the body's terrible price was coming due. "Elias," she breathed, the cold, calm shattering, replaced by a new, sharp fear. She ran to him. The knife cut had been deep. She helped him inside, easing him down onto the furs by the hearth. This was a wound she knew. This was a task she had trained for. Her fear, once a paralyzing fog, now sharpened into a focused, healing blade. She fetched her herbs, the linen, the clean water. Her hands did not tremble. She cleaned the wounds, one on his arm, the other on his ribs, with a practiced, gentle efficiency. He watched her, his eyes dark with pain, but also with a profound, steady trust. She was not the child he had to protect. She was the woman who was saving him. As she stitched the deeper cut on his side with a fine sinew thread, her movements sure and steady, the last of their bargain evaporated. This was not a debt being paid. This was the devoted, intimate care of a family. The meadow healed. The heavy snows of winter came, a deep, cleansing white that covered the last stains of the battle, burying the bodies of the intruders in a cold, silent grave. The cabin became their world. The rhythm of their life, once defined by survival, now deepened into a shared existence. Eli's wounds healed slowly, and in those weeks of his convalescence, their roles were fully reversed. Lyra hunted. She took the rifle, her small, pale form moving like a snow spirit through the drifts, and she brought back rabbits and grouse. She tended the goats, she kept the fire, she was the strength of their home. He watched her, his heart filled with a quiet, stunned awe. He had bought her for a handful of pelts, believing he was taking on a burden. He had received a goddess. The reading lessons continued. They sat by the fire, the storm howling outside, his deep voice and her soft, clear one filling the warm air with the words of old poets. She learned to laugh, a sound that at first startled her, like the call of a strange bird. It was a sound he found he could not live without. She filled the cabin with a life it had never known. She kept the columbine alive through the winter, a stubborn patch of green against the gray stone. She organized his jumbled supplies. She mended his clothes, her stitches now small and perfect. She was no longer a shadow in his home. She was its light. He, in turn, opened the last locked rooms of his heart. He told her stories of his father, the man who had shown him this meadow. He carved small, beautiful figures from scrap wood, a wolf, an eagle, a tiny perfect goat, for her to set on the shelf. They were no longer two outcasts. They were a family. Years passed, flowing as smoothly as the waterfall. The legend of the White Lady of Widow's Crown endured in the valleys below, but it changed. It was no longer a ghost story. It became a legend of grace. Trappers, lost in a sudden blizzard, would speak of a woman with hair like spun snow, appearing on a ledge to guide them toward a safe pass. Miners, their fires dead and their hands freezing, would wake to find a small, neat stack of firewood left near their camp by a silent, bearded man. Lyra and Eli, the outcasts, had become the mountain's guardians, its benevolent spirits, protecting the wilderness and the foolish men who sometimes trespassed within it. The narrator, who sees the beginning and the end, saw the truth that Purgatory Gulch never could. Marcus Thorne, a broken, penniless drunk, died in a gutter in Sacramento. His last words, a bitter curse about a treasure he had thrown away. He had been given a priceless, unique jewel, and in his superstitious, civilized blindness, he had seen only a flawed stone. Elias Hawke, the savage, the hermit, had looked at the same stone and seen the light trapped within. He had not just received a goddess, he had given her the safety to be born. On a warm summer evening, high on a ledge overlooking the meadow, Lyra and Eli sat, watching the sunset. She was a woman now, her beauty no longer spectral, but serene and timeless, her pale skin glowing in the golden light. He was older, his beard more gray than brown, but the ancient wisdom in his eyes was softened by a deep, abiding peace. He took her hand, his large and scarred, hers small and strong. They said nothing. They had no need for words. They watched the sky bleed into 1,000 colors, two souls discarded by the world, who had found their entire universe on a hidden mountain, a found family built in the very place that was supposed to be their exile. Lyra, the child of shadow, found her home in the light of the high peaks, proving that what one world casts aside, another can treasure as divine. If you believe that even the most discarded soul can find their strength, and that true family is forged not in blood, but in sacrifice and acceptance, show your support. Leave a like on this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Lyra's journey spoke to you? And don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss another story from the wild heart of the mountains. We thank you for listening, and hope you find your own peace, wherever your sanctuary may be.